Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight at our focus on some weeds and all of the herbicides and all the things that go with it. Tonight is brought to you, it sounds like a commercial, tonight is brought to you by the Kholo Creek Catchment Group. We're a small group that's just started up out here in the western suburbs. We sort of focus on Kholo Creek and the greater catchment. So to put it in geographic terms, essentially it's Mount Crosby out towards Lake Manchester, Corona Downs, that sort of geographic area. We've started up about a year ago, and this is our first really education, our second actually, weed-focused education night, and Andrew Wills from Brisbane City Council will be our expert for tonight. So thank you very much for joining them. Before we start, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we live and work on and do our work, and acknowledge their leadership and leaders, both past and emerging. Andrew, over to you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Brisbane City Council specifically for giving us the time and the experts to learn on this very important topic. So Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Dennis. Hi everyone. As mentioned by Dennis, I've had roughly 22 years in the weed industry within Brisbane City Council. So hopefully tonight I can give you some useful information about understanding herbicides and how to use them effectively in a bush care setting. So before I start into this, I'll just explain that historically we've done two kinds of herbicide training for people. One for private landholders through our Land for Wildlife program, and a second for Habitat Brisbane program. It's important to understand the distinction of them, and I'll get into this a bit later into the presentation about what you can do on your own land and what you can do on public lands. If that's not clear at all by the end of this presentation, please feel free to follow up with either Anna or myself just for clarity around what we do, because it is a fairly legalistic area. So without further ado, I will launch in now to the presentation. Starting off with the literal definition of a herbicide, an agent usually chemical for killing or inhibiting the growth of unwanted plants. Very broad, very non-specific, and what you'll see that comes out of this is that there's a good reason for this, is that from a chemistry perspective, there's a lot of different ways different forms of herbicide can take. So I'll just sort of step through some of the ways we actually define herbicides to begin with and differentiate from one herbicide to the next. First and foremost, we have modes of action. If you have a look at these little objects over here, what you see is that herbicides work very much like a key arrangement. The arrangement of the actual enzyme or process that it targets within the plant must actually fit with the chemical processes of the actual chemical structure of the herbicide. So what we see in the first diagram is an obvious gap over here between the two, which basically shows that there's an incompatibility in the mode of action and the enzymatic process of the plant itself. In the second, we see the key is actually formed and the enzymatic process can't be completed, therefore the plant dies. What this is just a graphical representation to demonstrate that there's two parts to this process. There's the chemical and then the target that it must interact with. So mode of action then leads us on to a few different ways in which the herbicides will work. Most of the herbicides that you'll use will be what we call systemic. They move through the tissue of the plant and find the areas of target sites to which they bind. The other type of herbicide in the classical sense is what we call a contact herbicide. That's one that merely comes into contact with the plant and does direct damage to the parts that it contacts. They're not typically useful to us in a bush care setting. Most of what you'll be using will be systemics. A third category, which we won't really go into here, is pre-emergent herbicides. That's something that you apply at the ground level, and it prevents the plant at the very early germination stages from being able to come through and become a pest. These have no place in bush care because we're all about regeneration. And if you're blocking one kind of seed, then you're probably blocking the native kind too. Of the systemics, you'll find that there's two major groupings that we'll be looking at, one of which is selective. That'll target an enzyme that's only present in a specific kind of plant, leading to a selective result. Or a classic example of these are all your group I's. So the things that you use to take out the bindies in your front lawn only targets auxins that are present only in broadleaf plants. The other kind is the non-selective, which basically targets something far more general. In the instance of glyphosate, for example, you've got a group M. It basically works on an enzymatic process that's present in all plants. So a second way we can look at how herbicides work is by their toxicity. A very famous quote, it is only the dose that makes a thing a poison. In other words, everything's toxic at certain levels. To demonstrate this, if you look at the table over here, what you'll see is a bunch of everyday products that have far more toxic levels in them than, say, for example, herbicides. And classic example being common salt is more toxic than glyphosate by most standards. How do we measure this? Well, there's two forms really. There's an acute dose poison, which is something that exceeds your tolerances in a single dose. And then there's chronic, which is repeated exposure over time type things. When we talk about this, we're measuring this in both chronic and acute terms with what we call lethal dose 50. That is the amount that killed half the test subjects on which it was administered to. Again, to separate that whole distinction between one herbicide and another, I'm just going to give you a bit of a comparison here between two herbicides that are still registered and in use. We have paraquat with an LD50 of 20 milligrams per kilogram. So in an 80 kilogram person, 1.6 grams of this will be sufficient enough to cause a toxic response. That means that in your average container, you've got about 156 lethal doses. That's why it's a very highly controlled product. Glyphosate, by contrast, with a lethal dose 50 of 4,500 milligrams per kilogram, you'd need 360 grams in to give a one acute dose for a human being. So you basically need to drink a litre of it in one hit. So it's important to remember that most herbicides, it's very rare to see a herbicide like paraquat, which is so toxic to a human being. Most of them are designed not to cause harm in a human or an animal, and most of them are formulated so that you do not accumulate over time to create the chronic doses. Another way of looking at herbicides is how they impact upon the environment. So there's a few basic ways in which we have to look at this and take care to avoid creating damage. The first and most obvious of which is drift, which occurs when you can spray. Drift is a product of effectively the herbicide being affected by the atmospheric conditions around it. There's a whole bunch of techniques that we use to mitigate drift in the environment, including calibrating the equipment correctly, selecting herbicides which are less volatile, keeping the nozzle of our spray equipment close to the target area, and most importantly, making sure we spray in favourable weather conditions, because too much wind is a problem, too little wind is a problem when you're dealing with something like drift. Persistence is, so drift and volatilization are a product of atmospheric influence. Persistence and mobility come down to how the herbicide interacts with the ground around them, whether they bind tightly to the soils, whether they break down fairly quickly. And this becomes a product once again of the environment in which they're in. So in aquatic situations, there'll be a tendency for these products to potentially move more rapidly. And this will also be an issue in leachable soils. The fourth property that you need to look at from an ecotoxicity perspective is bioaccumulation, the ability of that herbicide to continue to accumulate within systems and be uptaken by plants or animals within that system. It's important to remember once again that all herbicides are formulated to try and reduce their impacts in all of these places. Oops. Apologies. So how do we go about selecting the right herbicides for what we want to use? The first step is reading and understanding the labels, and this is implicit in all herbicide use, that you should always read labels carefully and understand the statements that are made on there before going ahead and using them. Your basic label at the face of it is going to give you a whole bunch of information right away on the front as to how it should be used and where it should be used. But as you go further and further through the label, you'll find pretty much all the information should be there. So it's a case of understanding the terminology and a case of being able to apply that to the circumstances in which you're using it. So as we step through, on the first instance, we'll get a bit of an indication of its overall toxicity at the top. Underneath this, we'll get a name. That's probably the most useless bit of information at all of the lot, because that's just a commercial and trade name. Under this, we get our concentration. This is very important because it's important to remember that depending on how much of the herbicide is present within the carrier will often dictate how that herbicide should be diluted and how hazardous that herbicide may be, both to the user and to the environment around it. In this instance, we're talking about 500 grams per litre, so effectively this product would have a 50% concentration of product. The mode of action is identified here. This is a group I herbicide, in keeping with it being a 2,4-D product. And underneath, you'll get a very basic statement of claims here. This is followed up further along by information that'll actually specify the weeds that can be used and the rates on which each should be used, your overall volumes, and other important registration information will be there. As we move further through the label, you'll also get information directly relating to its toxicological profile, its ecotox profile, and the dilution rates that it should be used at for best effect. It's important to remember when you're talking about dilution rates, more is not necessarily more. Quite often, increasing dilution, increasing the amount of product that you put in a given amount of water will not make it more effective. And so it's a common misnomer and people quite often do it. Adding more Roundup to the mix is generally not necessarily a good idea when you're going beyond the recommended labels. There are certain exceptions to that, but I would stress once again that following dilution rates is usually the most effective way to get a good kill on the plant. The alternative to using a herbicide purely as it's stated on the label is via an off-label permit. So, this is very important for us because in an environmental management setting, a lot of herbicides are simply not formulated for our purposes. This means that quite often you can't find the weed that you want to target on a label of a given herbicide. The off-label permit is specifically designed to give you a little bit more leeway in that scope. It must be stated, you must remember though that the permit only gives you permission to vary so much from the original use of the product. If it's not explicitly stated that you have permission to vary the use of the product here, then you can't use your own interpretation to then say it would be okay to use it on these other products. All of this is governed by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, and all of it is, as you'll see later on, legally binding. So just stepping through a few of the herbicides that we use very commonly in environmental settings, and interestingly enough, these are the ones that you have implicit approval to use under the bush care settings for the catchment group. So where it comes to the bush care site that the catchment is currently managing, these are the herbicides that you have permission to use in accordance with the label directions. Anything outside of this is something that we'll need to discuss and work through on a risk assessment basis. So just stepping through this, Arrays 360 bioaquatic, commonly known as frog-friendly glyphosate. You'll find that this product will invariably have 360 grams per litre of product in it, so it's at about 36% before you mix it out of the drum. It's a group M herbicide, which is EPSPS inhibitor. Essentially, the shorthand version is that it blocks a waste production process for the plant, so it effectively sort of prevents it from being able to get rid of a product called shikimate, which then builds up to toxic levels in the system. It's extremely low toxicity by our considerations at 4,500 milligrams per kilogram. It has a very low ecological toxicity, interestingly enough, not because of a short half-life, but because it has a really strong coefficient of friction, which essentially means that it binds to dirt and can't be removed again almost immediately. One of the interesting things about Roundup is that you really can't use dirty water of any kind, because the dirt in the water will actually bind the herbicide before it leaves the spray pack. It's generally considered to have a very low resistance risk, although that may be a problem leading forward as they continue to manufacture genetically modified crops that are indeed resistant. It's particularly useful to us because it has aquatic registration. So around creeksides and in sensitive areas, it's fairly safe to use as long as you're following the label directions. Another commonly used bush care herbicide is Star Rain Advance. This is fluroxapyr. One of the handy things about this is that it's an ester formation, so it's both water and oil soluble. You can spray this out of a backpack, or you can use it for basal barking as well. It's considered actually interesting. Oh, sorry, it's a group I herbicide, which means it's an auxin mimic. It should have no effect whatsoever on grasses because auxins are part of the secondary thickening process that only occurs in woody weeds. It's considered non-toxic at all, and you'll note that up the top it simply has a warning statement saying read safety directions before opening and use. The recorded lethal dose 50 is 5,000 milligrams per kilogram, which is an extremely high number. Oh, sorry, I should have specified earlier. The larger the number on LD50, the safer the product is to use. As this number starts to creep down, obviously the concentration is higher. It's considered to have moderate ecological toxicity, and this is why we don't consider it safe to apply in waterways. It has a very low resistance risk and no aquatic registration. So this is one that we consider to be very safe to use on dry ground, and one that in particular, as we'll go through later, is really useful from a basal barking perspective, which, if you're using it in this way, kind of reduces this concern about its ecological toxicity that we've discussed down here. Another very commonly used one is what we call brush off, or metsulfuron methyl. Metsulfuron methyl is only water soluble. You can't basal bark with it the way you can with the other. And in fact, it's barely water soluble, which is a bit of a problem, that you have to use a wetting agent with this product at all times, because it just simply won't stay in the water if you don't run it with a polymer. If you have any, we'll step through this in our demonstration day anyway, but it's important to remember that this product comes with some challenges both with mixing and storing. Again, it's a Group B herbicide, which is an ALS inhibitor. This is actually a pathway people don't really understand terribly well at all. So it's a fairly slow-acting pathway is the main and important thing to remember, which is you can apply brush off and not see results for quite some time, but when you do, they're pretty impressive. It is considered non-toxic once again, and again you can see this on the label, the lack of warning instructions of any kind, or lack of detailed warning instructions. It has a very low holding, it has a very low friction of coefficient, which is why we do not like it to be used in the waterways at all, not aquatically registered. Another concern with this product is that Group B herbicides are notorious for resistance issues, which means that typically speaking, it's not a great idea to rely on brush off permanently, as there's a good chance that plants will develop a resistance and it will stop being effective over time. The other important thing, other than the label, that you really should read and understand from a personal perspective is the material safety data sheets. All of these products should have that are properly registered in Australia should have both the label and a material safety data sheet to go with it. It should step through literally all of the safety concerns and with the product and give you pretty clear guidance on how to store it. Just an example of a material safety data sheet here. Oh, and of course it hasn't shown up on the screen, unfortunately. Apologies, that's not actually going to work. An example that you can look up in your own time, or flick on this one we send through the presentation. It'll actually give you a material safety data sheet for water, which is actually a highly corrosive product. Has a range of toxicological properties, and when put down on paper is remarkably scary, and you probably wouldn't want to put it in your body. The important thing to remember here is that all products, once again, as sort of stated earlier, have thresholds, and it's important to understand where these thresholds are in order to be able to manage and use them safely, right from their storage through handling, mixing, and heaven forbid spills and disposals. So through that we get a range of products, as I've sort of stepped through very, very quickly there, that can be used in effectively in bush care settings. It's important to remember that some of they have a range of different ways in which they can be applied to A, get better effect, and B, take advantage of some of the biological and chemistry interactions that you see occurring. So we'll step into the basics of weed control. Is that you'll typically never purely undertake weed control in a chemical sense. There will always be a physical control element. Foliar spray is probably the most commonly understood and known application technique, and that's one that we'll probably spend a bit of time on here, and definitely a lot of time on in the demonstration. Cut stump is a very commonly used one that we use typically in woody weeds, but also potentially in vines as well. Stem injection commonly used only in larger, woodier trees and vines as a technique that's quite common, where you want to leave the tree or the weed in situ to create some sort of structure or habitat. And two more techniques that are very commonly used as well are what we call scrape and paint, which to a great extent works along similar lines to cut stumping, and basal bark spray, which is ironically enough a very similar but a chemical version of stem injection. And this just reinforces the point. There's very unlikely to use just one technique, even for the same weed, as you work your way through this. And this is something we'll step through on site, how as the bush care activities in a given site progress, you'll start to see different techniques and different activities being applied to take advantage of previous activities and techniques. So foliar spraying, suitable for grasses, shrubs and low-growing plants with significant foliar cover. It's important to remember that you need a lot of leaves on there if you're trying to force enough herbicide through those leaves to be able to kill the entire plant. Where you've got very limited leaf cover, you're not likely to be able to achieve those sorts of outcomes. So essentially what you're looking at is being able to get complete coverage to around 80%. You also need to be able to manage your droplet sizes so that you don't have, you've got the right size to be able to apply to the plant and get those kind of coverage without getting too much moving through the air around it or beyond it onto other targets. Spraying herbicide, foliar spraying in particular, use of all herbicides should be applied to actively growing plants. Herbicides work best, particularly translocatable herbicides, when the plant is active and healthy. So this is particularly relevant when we talk about foliar spraying though, because again, you're relying on being able to get that herbicide through the leaf into the vascular system and moving through the plant. So when you're talking about plants that are under stress, spindly, or have insufficient leaf coverage, don't foliar spray them. You're wasting your time. You'd be much better off actually at that stage either pruning or fertilizing them and then coming back and spraying them later when they've had a chance to get some growth back on. This is actually a really good photo of someone undertaking foliar spray, because that's roughly about how high you should be off the ground. There is an argument for saying that you can be applying herbicides up to 45 degrees from yourself directed towards the ground. But anything higher than that, and you really shouldn't be considering it in the first place. The reason for this effectively is that once you start atomizing all of this spray sheet, you do create an unstable product which is susceptible to movement in the air. The key to being able to mitigate this is check the weather forecast before you look to spray and really look for those right conditions. Scope the area for things that are sensitive and make sure that you're spraying in a way that avoids those. You really never want to be spraying when temperature, you never want to be spraying in temperatures above 28 degrees. At that point in time, you really are starting to affect any of the products that we use, and probably asking to not get much onto the plants at all. Do not spray under completely calm conditions or in excessively windy conditions. The general rule is less than 3 kilometers an hour is a bit problematic for the plants, because there is calm conditions actually allow it evaporation and transpiration of the product to become extreme. And in anything above 15 kilometers an hour, you're really starting to risk not being able to direct the herbicide to where you need it to go. You really want to keep your spray height nice and low, so as low as you can get and still effectively be able to get a good spray coverage on the plant. Typically speaking, 10 to 15 centimeters away from your target is good, but certainly no greater than 30 to 40 centimeters away from your target. You should be using correct technique and posture to step through and keep the wand at a close distance to the body at the same time. You really also need to avoid any crosswinds or winds that are moving or winds that are moving behind you. These tend to create conditions that are more drift susceptible. If you do have to deal with a light breeze coming to spray, it's better to actually move into the direction of the breeze rather than across it or have it at your back. Again, selection of herbicide is important with this sort of thing. Products like 2,4-D, for example, drift far more significantly than a product such as glyphosate. And what you'll tend to find is that ester formulations also tend to be more susceptible to drift. You'll find warnings on the product label that give you an indication of that. So it's, again, a case of making sure you read the label carefully before you start to do it. It's important to remember also post-spraying to record where you've sprayed, how much you've sprayed and what the conditions were on the day, because if there is an accusation after the fact, you will be expected to have kept records of that. That's something I'll step into again a little bit after. A different variation of splatter gun is a foliar spray is what we call splatter gun. This is basically formulated directly to address the issue that I was talking about earlier of limited foliar cover. A particular problem with lantana is that it can be very scaly and nasty at certain points of the year, have very limited leaf cover, and spraying it at that point is pretty much a waste of your time. By using a really high concentration, typically, well, always glyphosate, by using a really high concentration of about 1 to 10 and getting a really coarse droplet size, what we can tend to do is get very limited cover, but good uptake on the plant leaf surfaces. Essentially, this is mostly used on lantana, but other shrubs and bramble type bushes you might find of a use for it. It's a fairly specialised bit of equipment to begin with, and this is something that's used quite widely by our Land for Wildlife partners, but not something we use at all in bush care sites typically. A lot of the concerns that you have when you're foliar spraying are addressed in this, but it is still important to remember that you're dealing with a high concentration dosage here. So where you do get these larger droplets onto susceptible vegetation, you're far more likely to get a kill. In terms of atmospheric conditions and in terms of the growth habit of the plant, you can get away with being a little bit more you can get away with being a little bit less targeted in this instance, and you can get away with being a little bit less considered. It's important to recognise that this is only to be used, this sort of posture when spraying is only to be used with a splat gun. At no stage should you use a regular wand and atomise it at normal droplet sizes in this kind of direction. So one of the very commonly used weed control techniques on trees and shrubs is what we call cut stump. Realistically suitable only for woody weeds and vines. You're effectively fully removing the tree, but then applying the herbicide to deal with potentially regrowth and coppicing from the point of the removal. This is good where you're dealing with something that you can physically cut out entirely, so smaller trees and shrubs, and it's a solid technique in terms of being able to clear and open a bush site fairly quickly. Just a few things to bear in mind when you're doing this, though, is that the whole premise of cut stump application is that you're trying to get herbicide into this growing tissue around the edge here of the plant. And you need to do this almost instantaneously, because the mechanism by which you're doing is what's referred to as turgor pressure. So as the vascular system in the plant is drawing moisture up into the leaves, in the process, it forms a pathway for tissue for things to travel back down through the vascular tissue of the plant. Once you've cut it, this pathway immediately drops, very much like removing your finger from the top of a straw and watching the turgor pressure release there. There's nothing holding the water up into here. It's imperative to be able to get this herbicide into this tissue before that turgor pressure drops, because you need to draw it back into the root system of the plant to be fully effective. Just looking here at these techniques, it's important to recognize that there's no real need to paint the inner bit of the tree. This is what we call the dead wood. There's not actually any conduction, there's not actually any vascular tissue moving products up or down at this point in time. So you only really need to treat the active and growing area on the outside of the plant when you use this technique. Just some golden rules on here. This one, it really is best to work in pairs, and that's because you can physically have someone cutting while another person is starting to apply the herbicide before the cut is even complete. That is the best way to do a cut stump, and that is where you get your best results. Certainly don't ever get to a point where you go and cut a whole bunch of these, then come back 5 minutes later and start putting the herbicide on. By that stage, there's really no point in putting the herbicide on there at all. The plant is already callousing off and there's nothing to drag it down into the system. Realistically, how you go about doing it is up to you, but this is probably the best way to go with the little squirt bottles. You don't want to be mixing up large quantities of the concentrated herbicide in these sorts of doses. You don't want to be carrying it around in a little jar with you or anything like that. Something very small, and pick small areas to do at once, and that's the best way to be able to conduct cut stump, because it's quite often people will go ahead and do large areas of this and not manage to poison a single plant because they were so enthusiastic. That leads us on to stem injection. Stem injection is ideally used for similar sorts of targets that you would use cut stump on, only in this instance you're basically making the decision that the tree can stay where it is after it's been killed. There's a few reasons why you might do this. One is that it retains habitat and retains structure in a site that might otherwise be being denuded. It can also be easier in some settings to kill the tree and leave it in situ. The ability to kill trees this way varies quite significantly from tree to tree. There's essentially many different ways you can do this, but we've sort of simplified it down to a couple of different methods. The drill and fill method is literally old-fashioned. I'm just going to drill a hole into it and apply the herbicide directly into it. The challenge with this one is you really want to be able to get the depth right. If you drill too far and add the herbicide, you're kind of wasting your time. If you don't drill far enough, then the plant will kind of get around the edge of it. To make this further more complicated, the depth that you need to go to for each plant, for each tree, is kind of different from species to species, and for that matter, individual to individual. But if you're pretty good at being able to judge your cambium layers, this is the quickest and easiest way to introduce a fatal dose. You put your holes at 50 centimetre intervals, and again, just can apply the herbicide via a squirt bottle direct into each of the holes. It's also the neatest way to go in terms of entry into the plant. Frilling takes longer but tends to be more effective. So it says here, but you can use pretty much any sort of cutting tool. You make an angled cut through the bark into the sapwood every 5 to 10 centimetres. So essentially what you're doing here is you're increasing your surface area of application. And because if you actually look around this tree, because you're increasing your surface area of application, you tend to be more effective with frill ringing than you do with drill and fill if you're not certain of what you're doing. Again, there's a sort of cleverish trick here insofar as the cuts being made and the herbicides being delivered immediately. Again, time is pretty important with this sort of stuff. This is just to give you a bit of a demonstration down here. It really is important that you do it around all sides of the trunk at 50mm intervals. If you're trying to do this technique on multi-stem trunks, you need to maintain that 5cm pattern, 5 to 10cm pattern around each and every single trunk. The tendency is that with multi-stemmed plants, it'll be really hard if there's another tree here, for example, to be able to continue that pattern through. It's pretty important that you still do it. Even a small amount of conductive tissue left undamaged on the side of a tree may be enough to sustain it. So moving on to scrape and paint, which is particularly effective against sort of brambly vines and shrubby things. I've heard of people using this on Madeira vine, although it sounds like it could be pretty slow and painstaking. It is quite a good way of being able to introduce a pretty good amount of herbicide into some of these sort of tougher to get at weeds that don't easily present a surface that you can approach. So one of the theories behind this is that where you've got aerial tubers on something like Madeira vine, by being able to apply the herbicide through here and not actually cut stumping, there'll still continue to be turgor pressure, and that will draw the herbicide up to tubers up here, which theoretically will damage them and make them less viable before they hit the ground. If you can introduce sufficient herbicide through here, proportionate to what the tubers are up here, that's undoubtedly true. The challenge comes into knowing when you probably need to move to other techniques, and the important bit to remember here is that if you've got an entire curtain or wall of this Madeira vine, you may be better off using a cut stump method first and then coming back and stem scraping later as you start to get the smaller pieces down. And this is where it's important to sort of plan your site out, because what you'll often find is that as you work your way through the process, the techniques and approaches that you should take to control the weeds will change, and that's actually a positive sign. So what you want to do is lightly scrape about 20 to 30 centimeters of the stem, and you want to do both sides once again. As soon as possible, apply the herbicide afterwards, but it's not as critical as it is in cut stump to be able to get it on there immediately. I would still encourage it to happen though quickly, because the longer the plant is there and damaged, the more resistant it becomes to uptaking that herbicide. So yeah, that's stem scrape. Now, basal bark. The reason I said earlier is it's like stem injection is that instead of using a metal needle to transfer through or a axe to transfer through the bark, in this instance you're using a chemical to pass through the barrier. Now, typically, the herbicides that we use will be water soluble and only soluble in water. Ester forms such as starane are soluble in both water and oil. And so what this means is that when you mix it with oil, you can actually get it to travel through the bark of the plant, so long as the bark is not too thick. This gives it a big advantage on things like these trees you can see here, because obviously there's not much of a foliar area up here to be able to spray. So if the sufficient herbicide can be applied through here into the trunk, then there's no need to try and access up here. Again, you'll see the same approach being applied here, here, and here. And this is a great approach for woody weeds because quite often they simply just don't have the foliage to be attacked in other ways. So the technique basically involves ensuring you have complete coverage from a bare minimum of 30 centimeters up the trunk to the ground. Complete coverage means any roots exposed towards the edges too. The reason this is important is that a lot of these species will coppice and regrow from lower points underneath them. If you give them no lower point than the dirt, then they can't coppice or regrow. So there's no way that you can get reshooting occurring out of these spaces because of the application of the herbicide here. Once that chemical barrier is in place, growth up here will no longer be possible anyway. So effectively, by introducing the herbicide here, the plant is basically trapped because it can't cycle sugars from the, it can't cycle nutrition from the roots and sugars up to the leaves. So the technique basically requires complete coverage around all sides. Once again, you can't leave a side undone. So if you're talking about multi-stem trees, you need to do the gaps in between these areas here too, to prevent any possible pathways up from the ground. When we say mixed in a hydrocarbon carrier, typically, historically, that's been diesel. Now we have more safer products, BioSafe, for example, which is a biodegradable hydrocarbon carrier. It's completely derived from natural products and doesn't present the same sort of hazards to people as diesel does, being known to be a bit of a carcinogen. It's a really time-effective approach, really useful on things like ochna. Becomes less and less effective the thicker the bark is on the trees, because the hydrocarbon carrier can only do so much where it comes to transferring through the bark. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you're in areas where you have a weed that's predominantly got a soft skin and natives that are thicker barked, because it gives a greater degree of protection. But again, it's something that needs to be considered, that all these things have limitations at a certain point in time. So that takes us through the basic techniques, and we'll step through all of those in a lot more detail on site, because they're things that are much more easily understood when you can see it occurring in front of you. But we will share all those notes and we will share all those details with you, so that you can get a better understanding of anything that was discussed there. It would be remiss of me not to step into what your legal obligations are with relation to the use of herbicides in Queensland. And it's important to remember that they change when you're the landholder or not the landholder, but they never actually go away. You always have a responsibility to use and adhere to the rules where it comes to herbicides. The first and foremost one that you really need to be aware of is the Chemical Usage, Agricultural and Veterinary Control Act 1988. The key bit here is a product must be used in accordance with its label. So it's an offence under law to not follow the instructions on the label, or to use the product in a manner that's contrary to how it's stated on the label. As stated previously, the labels are all defined by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, who basically put all these products through a rigorous test of all of those earlier concerns I raised, such as ecotoxicity, toxicity, and the use rates for the product, and also step into what are acceptable and safe mix rates. The only way that you can get around using a product other than as stated on the label legally is to use an off-label permit. The one that we use most frequently is off-label permit 11463. It's specifically drafted for environmental weeds to address that concern I raised earlier, that predominantly a lot of these products are used for agricultural purposes rather than environmental purposes. That's widely recognised, and in an effort to address that, bodies like Biosecurity Queensland have developed this off-label permit to give you more options in the herbicides that you can use and the targets that you can use them on. Still very important to remember that it only gives you permission to vary uses as explicitly stated. You can't use any interpretation and assume that it then gives you permission to use a product that's totally unsafe in a waterway unless it's been explicitly stated. The easiest and best way to find out whether or not your product is properly registered for what you want to use it for is the nationally approved and maintained database that we call PubCris. When we forward through this presentation, these links will be active, at which point you can have a look in there. But essentially the database contains every registered product in Australia. So any herbicide anywhere that you have seen, heard, or had recommended to you should be present on this database if it's legal and approved. The portal allows you to search either via the target weed, the product name, or the active ingredient that is within that product. It also allows you to search for off-label permission to use products in another way. Essentially, it is there so that everyone can fly right. As I say, when we send out the resource packs that come with all of this stuff, we'll be able to step you through what's in, how that works in PubCris, and if there is a need, we can probably even use it as an example later on to go looking for a product and find its label and details. The second piece of legislation that's really important here is the Agricultural Chemicals Distribution Control Act. Essentially, this governs safe usage of herbicides and where you may apply herbicides. Predominantly, the concern of the Act was set up to prevent drift and damage to primary production, but it still applies more broadly to herbicide application in general. Essentially, the Act outlines that you have an obligation to be licensed for all commercial activities. We don't actually apply herbicides in commercial sense, but it is important to remember that the laws are drafted in quite interesting ways around this sort of thing. So, for example, if you're applying herbicides on land that is not occupied by you and not using powered equipment, and not using powered equipment and have the landholder's permission, you may be able to proceed without a license. Under any other circumstances, you are required to be licensed to be applying herbicides in a public space. This is important to recognise because we've talked about the applied approval to be able to undertake bush care on council lands. That approval is basically contingent on people abiding by the rules and the regulations that are outlined here. The Act also effectively requires you to maintain application records. This is where, when, and who sprayed herbicides at what time. So, with regard to how this applies to us in the use of herbicides, there's the clear distinction here that when you're on your own property, you must abide by the obligations of the Act to use the safe application practices and adhere to restrictions and maintain application records. As the landholder, it's your right to decide what herbicides and what techniques and approaches that you use. You should still consider obligations under the safe practices, but those are decisions you can make. Where you're talking about public lands, that permission and approval has come contingent on you only using the products that were outlined earlier with the Habitat Brisbane program. Anything that steps outside of standard bush care practice, as we consider it, is not necessarily approved on these lands. So it's very important to remember that there are significant constraints on what we will allow you to do on public land. And you may find that if you're dealing with other landholders, say for example Seqwater or other third parties, they may place even more greater restrictions on what they will and won't allow you to apply, particularly because we're talking about non-commercial activities. Here's just a good example of an easy record of herbicide application form that I would encourage you guys to maintain always on your herbicide on your sites. This is a bare minimum requirement for our Habitat Brisbane program, that each and every time herbicide application is undertaken, that you'll complete one of these record forms. If you just step across to the top, it's fairly self-explanatory. And realistically, there's no expectation that you will give a 100% accurate wind speed or direction. The aim of the game here is just to supply as much information as possible so that should there be an accusation of wrongdoing down the track, you have a clear record here that you were adhering to the ACDC Act and trying to do the right thing. So this is just to sort of reiterate what I was getting at earlier about the distinction between landholder and landholder's permission, because it's a very explicit and very important definition under the ACDC Act. So just reiterating again, on your own property, you may undertake whatever herbicide application you feel is appropriate. You are still obliged to follow all relevant legislation, but do not require any special permission from a third party to proceed. As a catchment group working on property that is not your own, you will require land manager approval to undertake herbicide application, and this will extend to defining what herbicide and application techniques are appropriate. As I've said earlier, there's implied permission for you guys to proceed with the activities as per the Habitat Brisbane program. Anything that steps above and beyond that is something that you would need to discuss with the Creek Catchment Officer and then by default the land manager. And just an important number to remember, the Poisons Information Centre 13/11/26. If, heaven forbid, you should ever have an adverse interaction with a chemical, either in bush care or otherwise, this is a very important number to call. Probably something that I didn't address in this presentation and should have addressed is that herbicides have defined hazards for your average person. There is always a risk that you or someone you know will have a predisposition, an allergy, or some sort of reaction to herbicide products. Quite often when we find that people do have reactions to these products, it's not even the herbicide itself, but a byproduct that it's mixed with. It happens in a really, really small percentage of cases, but where it does happen, people should take it very, very seriously. Even a product that is considered completely safe for 99.9% of the population can present hazard to that other small portion. So everyone should always exercise due care above and beyond the information I've just sort of provided to you all. But hopefully that gives you a really good insight into how herbicides work. I've covered that in lightning speed quite deliberately because I expect a lot of questions. So by all means, I will. And so I guess, Anna, are we open to taking questions or?
Yes, absolutely. I will read out the ones we've already received.
Yep, that'd be great.
Okay. So near the beginning or earlier on in the presentation, Ray mentioned that he finds combining the scraping, the cut stop method and then combining it with scraping the tissue below the cut helps to increase the absorption area. Do you have any comments to make in regards to that?
No, that's a fair observation indeed. The more you can increase the surface area on active, healthy tissue, the more herbicide you'll get to take up. So yes, that makes perfect sense that would work.
Yeah. And he followed that with, is the 10-second rule accurate?
No, the 10-second rule is not necessarily accurate. Particularly where you're talking cut stump, you really do need it to be almost immediate. And what I would suggest is that that's a good instance where probably etching and introducing some herbicide just below the cut area prior to completing the cut is probably a better outcome. But no, once you cut through the stump of the plant, the turgor pressure drops almost immediately.
Okay, that's good to know. You also said when you were talking about drilling and filling, you mentioned 50 centimetre intervals, and a couple of us were wondering if you meant 15 centimetre intervals.
I meant 5 to 10 centimetre intervals. Apologies.
Yep.
I was thinking 50 millimetre and saying centimetre.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Thank you for clarifying that. So it's between 5 to 10 centimetres. Okay.
Yep.
Liz has asked, would scrape paint work well for cat's claw creeper? Because there's probably more of that in the Kholo Creek catchment area than Madeira vine.
Yeah, probably less effective on cat's claw, I would argue, largely because it's got that sort of woodier texture. One of the reasons it's so effective on Madeira vine is it's a very high moisture content plant. Not to say it would not work though on cat's claw creeper. In my experience with cat's claw creeper though, the easiest thing to do is to cut it low to the ground, get a flush of regrowth, then start foliar spraying until you can wear down the tuber stores at the base.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that would be my opinion on that one. Not to say that it wouldn't necessarily work, but probably not the most effective approach for that particular weed.
Sure. Liz also followed that with, when would you choose basal barking over cut stump for woody weeds such as ochna or Chinese celtis?
Okay, with celtis, I would, the argument I would make mostly with the difference between cut stumping and basal barking is, the first consideration is, can the tree stay where it is and die without necessarily presenting a risk? The important things to consider there is the size of the tree and how much lateral limbs are on the tree. So a particularly large celtis with a lot of branches moving out over a bikeway, for example, that's where I would definitely cut stump rather than basal bark, because as that tree dies and decays, you would not want it falling over in that particular space. If it were in the middle of a bushland area and getting a tree lopping crew in there would be really tough, and it still has that thinner bark on it, that's where I would definitely employ the basal bark instead. There's no hard and fast rules around it, probably just reasons to lean towards one and or the other. In my experience, ochna at all stages is most susceptible to basal bark, and I would only ever basal bark it. Celtis at a certain point becomes less and less viable for it. I would argue that in the instance of celtis, it's about anything wider than about a 10 to anything wider than about a 20 centimetre diameter is starting to become problematic for basal bark on that particular tree, largely because of the girth of the bark that will be on there. At no stage would I consider ochna to be outside of the basal barking range. Okay.
Robin and Rodney have asked, do herbicides have a use by date, and how important is it if they do for efficacy?
Okay, about 2 years is the guaranteed shelf life of pretty much every properly registered product if you've stored it in accordance with the label. So that means keeping it out of the sun. That means making sure that you're keeping it sealed and not allowing contamination to creep into the drum. Beyond that, it's very hard to say. Most herbicides will remain fairly effective and useful, and for 3 to 4 to 5 years after that, but I can't. It's hard for me to say because we typically don't in council ever continue to use products beyond that sort of stage. Historically, there were some products that it was a really bad idea to keep on your shelf for any longer than what was on the label. They're typically things like organophosphates, which become less and less stable the longer it goes on. They're very uncommon these days, but if you have anything like that in your shed and you want to get rid of it, by all means talk to us because we will help you dispose of them properly. You don't want them to stay in your shed. Most modern products don't have a concern in that that basis. They just stop working well, or become less and less effective as it goes forward. Okay, great. Well, that was the last question that we had so far. If there are any more questions, people can either raise their hand and unmute themselves, or you can write it into the meeting chat. Otherwise, we'll probably take this opportunity to thank Kholo and Andrew, and I will hand it over to Dennis to finish up.
Thanks very much, Anna. Thank you, Andrew. A lot to take in. Look forward to getting the notes so I can revisit a few of these things. I found that happy to take additional questions once we've provided you guys with the notes as well. Yeah, it's a lot to take in, and that was a really quick overview. Sure. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks, Brisbane City Council. Thank you, Anna, and all the Creek Catchment guys. I found that really informative, so thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. Yep, thank you, and yeah, thanks for everyone's comments and questions. Thanks. Good night. Good night.